This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted that Professor Göran Adamson has joined me today from Berlin. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Europe in Berlin. Thanks very much, Professor, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Professor Adamson's strength and his work is in trying to understand this curious, shape shifting beast we call multiculturalism. Now, multiculturalism, of course, has been tried in various parts of the world, debated in many parts of the world. The UK, we all know about that. Of course, in recent years, across the EU, in Germany, in France, in Italy, in Sweden, across the board, the debate on multiculturalism has grown. And I want to talk to Göran Adamson today on his ideas on where this project is headed and what could yet be of it. Professor, let me begin by asking you, if you were to zoom out and look at the European multiculturalism experience, how would you see it?
Well, it has been over like the last 20 or 30 years. It has been seen as an enrichment, as something that will make Europe more diverse. I mean, that's also the buzzword, diversity, more interesting and like a better continent, because it has, I mean, the view has been for many decades that it is not a good thing to be nationalist. It's not a good thing to, see to your own interests, because, and these are some kind of funny associations that has been around for so long, and they have like almost taken us as captive in some kind of ideological whirlwind. It's this idea basically that if you favor your own nation, if you favor your own culture, this is dangerous, or could be dangerous. It is potentially dangerous because nationalism is close to patriotism, and patriotism is close to populism, right-wing populism, and even fascism, and even National Socialism. So I think the EU project has gradually and increasingly so started to embrace this kind of multicultural, almost autopilot, where anything which is not completely open, which is not completely diverse, any person who is not completely, utterly welcoming towards people from other cultures is a right-wing populist or worse. So, and these ideas, these are like isms. These are, political isms, like populism. They have been extremely important and extremely influential in Europe over the last 30 years. And the European Union, I would say, is a child of these ideas. And the leading people in the European Union, and the European Union as a big machine, have been fostering these ideas quite forcefully, and is fostering what you could say, the virtues of multiculturalism and the virtues of diversity, even though I think it is plain to see that these ideas, and including, quite considerable flows of migration into Europe, has caused problems for our continent. And if you ask the general population in Europe what they think about multiculturalism, the answer is not at all what the European Union, the leaders in the European Union are saying. So there is a divide here between the general population in Europe and the elites in Brussels. And that divide, maybe we can get back to this. This divide is dangerous. It's a kind of polarization about views, separating the elites in Brussels and the man and the woman on the street.
I will come back to that point about the elites in Brussels in just a moment because I have lots to ask you about that. But let me ask you another very fundamental question. Goran, sitting here in New Delhi as a historian, as an academic, when I think about patriotism as an Indian or nationalism as an Indian, it seems to me as a post colonial citizen of a post colonial state, without nationalism and patriotism, we wouldn't even exist because it was only 75 years ago that India, because it had patriotism and nationalism in large parts of its population, was able to overthrow the colonial yoke. Now, looking at the
Yes.
same topics from, say, Berlin or from Paris, we hear a very different idea. And I understand where that idea comes from. Of course, it comes from the experience of National Socialism, it comes from the 30 Years' War, and so on and so forth. But this is the problem. It's almost like the West, and especially in Europe, don't even understand what countries like India are talking about when they talk about nationalism and patriotism. There's a fundamental difference in understanding. How do you think we can bridge this?
Well, I am not sure if we can bridge it. And I think that I would like to say that the continent where people have somehow confused the idea of multiculturalism, or where they don't seem to get it right. It's not India, it's not Asia, it's not Thailand or Vietnam. I've lived in those countries, but it's Europe, it's Sweden, it's Britain, it's England, it's France. And clearly, we all know that what Hitler did was a bad thing, what Mussolini did was a bad thing. But the reaction to that has been absolutely exaggerated. I would say that we are now living in it's a kind of luxury situation where we somehow completely have forgotten that nationalism and even patriotism means unity. It means that we can unite for a common goal. And this goal isn't necessarily the extinction of other races. This goal is often to try to build a better society, like India, like Vietnam, like, most cases. So I think there's a kind of purism or fanaticism going on among many academics and intellectuals and politicians in Sweden, where we have simply forgotten the virtues of nationalism as a uniting force for democracy, as a uniting force for women's rights, as a uniting force for peace. And so we have simply gone missing in some kind of whirlwind of globalizing or multicultural frenzy, where we cannot stop thinking about that man in Germany, the man with the moustache. So anything that questions a completely wide open idea and questions the most intense advocacy of multiculturalism is deemed as racist or worse. So I think, and in Europe, I think, as opposed to in India, and I think as opposed to in most places, it is very hard to have a recent discussion on multiculturalism, to try to talk about the upside of multiculturalism, but also the problems of multiculturalism, because very often you are instantly dismissed, and the answer is not, a curious answer like, okay, so what do you mean? The answer is an emotional answer, like saying, how can you say that? I thought I knew you, and so forth. So this is the kind of situation we're faced with in Europe today. So it's and if you compare India and my own country, Sweden or Germany, I think India's got it right, because I'm not an expert in India, but I think you have a much more sane, balanced, reasoned discussion on multiculturalism, whereas in Europe everything immediately gets extremely emotional and heated, and what people are doing, they are they don't try to win an argument with the best argument. They try to win with the moral high ground. They try to win by proving somehow that they are more virtuous, they are more inclusive, they are more tolerant, and so forth. But these buzzwords, as we all know, they mean next to nothing. So it's a very void, empty game. And the people who are likely to win these games, these anti-intellectual games, are not intellectuals like me. Sorry to be pretentious, but other types of people. And so it's a very sad story in Europe, and we are trying to get it straight, but it's an uphill battle, I can tell you.
to Europe and Sweden specifically in just a moment, but I have another question, a follow-up question from my last question. Could you reflect upon the following? It is very curious to many Asians and certainly to many Indians that having thrown off a deeply exploitative colonial power only 75 years ago, Great Britain, which really exploited India and stole from India, today we have the British telling us that supposedly we talking about patriotism and nationalism is a bad thing.
Mhm.
This is a very ironic divide, and often Indians and other, perhaps certainly other Asians, I'm sure, wonder, since there's been, and I'm going to talk about India here because there's so much study of India in various parts, in Berlin, for instance, and other parts of Germany, in France, in England. There's so much study of India.
Mhm.
Why is this simple logic of the difference between a post-colonial idea of nationalism and patriotism and a colonial, countries that colonize others, their perspective can be very different? Why is this not understood in Europe?
Uh, could you possibly explain, you mean why nationalism has a different reputation in Europe as opposed to in India?
Why can't, for instance, in Europe,
Yeah.
can't many people, especially the elites, not understand that certainly, say from somebody standing in Paris, for instance, or
Yes.
London, why
Yes.
can't they understand that standing in New Delhi or Mumbai, the what we think about nationalism and patriotism as a post-colonial country, of course,
Yes.
would be very different from somebody standing in France
Uh,
or
oh,
England,
of
which are
course,
colonial
of
countries.
course, of course, you're absolutely right. And I mean, clearly, the fact that you have been under the yoke of the British Empire for so long makes it, twice, three times more reasonable for you to be in favor of your nationalism. So that's very true. And I mean, when you say that Europeans fail to understand that, I think you must be referring to, certain intellectuals, certain academics. I, for one, surely understand how you see this, but but it still puzzles me a lot, the fact that in, you could say, in most places outside of the West, nationalism is not a controversial thing, because, and again, I would like to stress this. I think it is there is a trace, and not only a trace of arrogance, in the fact that in Europe and the United States, we have these very, I mean, strong tendencies among the elites, where nationalism has this is immediately associated with far right wing extremism, when in fact it is absolutely vital if you want to have if you want to create, actually, if you want to create a society, you need nationalism. You need a uniting force. And that, that's also something we could talk a lot about in relation to multiculturalism and diversity, because multiculturalism, as you hear in the word, many cultures, a plurality of cultures, means that we no longer have one society, one community. We are supposed to have 4, 5, 6 communities, which are supposed, according to the advocates of diversity, supposed to live together in harmony. And I would say that that thing was always a wild guess, and it is a wild guess, and will always remain a wild guess, and at best an optimistic aspiration. And I mean, my take on this is that either you have a society focused on one community with, one leading set of ideas, or you don't have a community. Either you have a community focused on one idea, or you have many communities and many societies. You cannot have a society, in my view, my humble view, which is composed of many diverging societies, many diverging cultures. I don't think it's possible.
Let's talk about the European experience, including the British experience then. In a sense, this idea, I remember as a schoolboy listening to Tony Blair talking about how Britain had become global Britain and so on and so forth, right? I
Mhm.
remember only 10 years ago going to Malmo as one of the safest places in the world and joking to
Yeah.
my Swedish friends that, the only, even if, say, a dog on the road gets hurt by a bicycle, it'll become frontline news in Malmo because you guys are so safe. And coming from India, we used to really admire that, these societies are almost near perfect as far as social tension is concerned. There's been radical change in the situation only 10 years, 20 years later, as the case may be in England and in Sweden. Talk to us a little bit to begin with about Sweden. It was considered widely, even 10 years ago, as one of the near perfect places on earth. A very cohesive society, wealthy, peaceful, very little social tension. At least that's what it seemed to people from the outside. What
Mhm.
went wrong?
Well, everything everything went wrong. I think you could say that it takes 150 years to create a smooth, homogeneous, well functioning society with a lot of social trust, and maybe it takes 20 years to destroy it. And I don't want to be a pessimist, but I think we are in the middle of a case of a case of destruction of our society, because we have been, again, like I talked about before, completely mesmerized by an idea which I would claim runs against the grain of any detached observation of what makes a society function, namely social cohesion, namely social trust. And let me just briefly mention the American sociologist and political theorist Robert Putnam. He wrote a piece about 20 years ago where he investigated what kind of societies or communities are characterized by social trust. And he came to the conclusion that multicultural societies like Los Angeles and so forth were characterized by less social trust, whereas communities in Wyoming, for instance, were characterized by more social trust. More homogeneous communities are characterized by more social trust. So I think that's a very basic insight that also applies in Sweden. And I can cite, to show you some kind of a very interesting trend, a shift in Sweden. The former Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander, he said, I think it was in the late 1960s, he said this, and maybe you should remember this, everyone who's listening to this. He said, and he was a social democrat, he said, I think what constitutes Sweden is that we have a great sense of community, and this is because we are so much alike, which means that we are not suffering all these tensions that are so prevalent in many other cultures. Something like that, he said. So, but today you would never hear anyone to the left of the Sweden Democrats, a party supposed to be far right, but I think it's just a social conservative party. Nobody would dare to say that today. So what used to be a statement that used to be almost a banality among social democrats some 60 years ago is now impossible to say unless you are, or at least considered to be, a far right winger. So the whole ideology has shifted leftwards quite dramatically, and this has, of course, society. And I think this is an indication of a shift, complete shift in thinking. And this has also allowed that Sweden has opened the borders for a very dramatic, increase in migrants over the last 20, 30 years. And so that's like, and I think we have huge problems ahead of us. And these problems are not exclusively, but to a large extent, I think, caused by, again, our misconception about the virtues of multiculturalism and diversity. I mean, and in essence, what constitutes a functioning society. And I can rephrase this. I can say that you can ask the question, are we supposed to focus on the things we share, or are we supposed to focus on the things that we do not share? If we are supposed to focus on the things we do not share, where does that lead us? If we are supposed to focus on difference, is that really like a good idea if you want to create a community and a well-functioning society? Or are we supposed to focus on similarities? If you want to show solidarity, for instance, do you think solidarity is always compatible with the virtues of multiculturalism and the virtues of difference? I am not sure. So,
I want to
yeah,
ask you, I remember when all of this began, I remember being at, say, Lund University talking to, academics when the
yeah,
first waves of immigration were being planned, or they were coming in, or the numbers were beginning to rise.
yeah.
And there was a consensus almost among academics I met in Malmo, I met in Stockholm, I met in Lund, and so on and so forth, that look, we're a very large country, we have lots of space, and we're a wealthy country. So when we bring people in, we have both the space and the monetary ability to help them, which I
Mhm,
thought was a noble idea. Yet, what seemed interesting to me, though, that somehow the conversation about the fact that the next very important step has to be assimilation
mhm.
was only very hesitantly mentioned, if at all.
Yes, yes,
Explain to me why. Because at the end of the day, if you look at, say, a Singaporean example, just as an
yeah,
example,
yes.
the entire model of having many communities together in that tiny island works because of this entire idea that they have very strict rules, and
Mhm.
assimilation is a very strong idea. Why
Yeah.
would a country like Sweden think that the natural step after getting so many people from outside in has to be assimilation? Why be afraid of assimilation?
Look, it's funny, but because these politicians, they were not only social democrats who had this exhibited this kind of fanatic optimism. Also, some conservatives talked along these lines. But human beings are not rabbits. We can't just jump around the countryside having a good time. Uh, if it's about human beings, if it's about integration of human beings, there has to be some kind of commonality. Otherwise, nothing will work. There has to be some commonality about views, ideas, perspectives, and and I mean, if you would take that away, if you would simply think that you don't have to have any kind of commonalities or unifying ideas, well, that's fine. Then anything works. But I think that the reason why, to get back to this idea of assimilation, I think the reason why Sweden somehow, leading academics and politicians and so forth, intellectuals in Sweden, stopped for the idea of integration and somehow shunned the notion of assimilation is to get back to the idea of multiculturalism again and the idea of diversity, because assimilation is too strong. It is seen as too ruthless. It is seen as an idea whereby we are forcing people who come to Sweden to be Swedish people, to simply change and to be like us. But I actually think that the idea of assimilation has a few things going for it for a number of reasons. And one reason, I think, is that if you would move from the rather non-committal idea of integration, namely live as you want, you pay tax and then you can keep your culture, you don't even need to learn the language. If you move from that to the more committal idea of assimilation, you would be forced to be confronted with the question: is this possible? Can these people live in our country? That is the very crucial question that is bound to arrive in front of your eyes. If you just talk about integration, that's fine. Then that you don't have that problem. But if you're forced to talk about assimilation, you need to ask yourself: is it, for instance, to be more precise, is it, for instance, possible for people from Somalia or people with a radical Muslim persuasion to live in Sweden. Because when they come, and people from these regions, I'm not saying what is good or bad here, but if people from these regions come to Sweden, it is a little bit like going to the moon, because Sweden for these people is extremely different. It's more different than we seem to realize. And then you need to ask yourself, can these people somehow morph and change and live in our culture without being, almost like reduced to a second or third or fourth rate individuals with no access to our culture, no access to our language, no access to our history, wandering around, feeling a little bit confused. You can see these people, and sometimes I pity them, because somehow they are dragged into our culture, dragged into our country, dragged into Germany, and they are supposed to be enriching, and it's supposed to be a lovely thing for all of us. But I don't think it is. I think assimilation forces you to ask that question: does this work? And I can phrase it maybe from another point of view. You can also ask, this question, which is, I think, quite poignant. You can ask this question. We should, instead of focusing similarities, we should try to focus the things that brings us together. The things that brings us together. The things that unites us. The things we share. There's only one question here. There's only one fundamental question you need to ask yourself, and this is the crucial question. What do we share? Or maybe put it differently. Suppose we do not share anything at all. If we do not share anything at all, what are we supposed to do? If we don't share anything, I think the only reasonable way forward is to do what, there's a nice saying for this. It's to agree to disagree. Like, I can take a case in point. Erdogan, the Turkish president. I think, the things we share with this man is very little, maybe nothing. So are we supposed to focus on the things we share? Are we supposed to work hard to find a common ground? I'm not sure it's worth it. Maybe it's better to admit defeat, and realize that when it comes to certain regions of the world, certain cultures, certain religions, the likelihood of finding a common ground, of finding ways to coexist by means of assimilation, maybe isn't there. And if it isn't there, maybe we have to give up. And I'm not saying giving up like a pessimistic thing. I'm saying giving up like trying to find an alternative way forward. Yeah. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I want to ask you a question. I want to take these examples that you're citing, which are very, very powerful and important examples, to which were two examples that, for instance, happened with people who moved from South Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, to America and to England and so on and so forth. Like if you look at Indians in America, they are now the most well adjusted, it's an ideal minority, as it were, because they are the wealthiest and most educated and most well assimilated. But I feel that happened because it's not like they landed there and became assimilated by magic, right? It happened because there was a strong social and governmental driving force that America was, quote unquote, a melting pot. And in order to do well in America, you had to, in a sense, melt a bit, if you know what I mean. And if you melted a little bit, you assimilated in that society. You began to value baseball and not just cricket, for instance. You began to, value American food and, American TV and, 4th of July and not just, 15th of August and so on and so forth, right? Tell me why. And this is almost, how should I put it? This was almost a very practical, non-controversial thing to say. America called itself a melting pot even a few years ago. This was non-controversial even in Britain. Why is this very commonsensical thing that a guiding force must be provided by the state and society to help people and to nudge people to assimilate become so controversial that it can't even be spoken of in Sweden, in Germany, in France, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, multiculturalism is so silly. I think there is a video clip on YouTube where some chef, he asks an Indian lady, "So what do you want, rice and curry?" And she says, "I want a burger." And he doesn't understand it. So he repeats the question, "Do you want rice and curry?" And she says, "No, give me a burger, a double burger," she says. And it's like, this is the multicultural nightmare, in my view, that you are caught, you are imprisoned by your culture. You're not allowed to have American food. You're not allowed to have, you just need to have your rice and curry because this is for you, because we are supposed to be expressing our cultural identity and all that. And I think it's ridiculous. It's a kind of, we are supposed to walk around flashing our cultural identities, flashing our language, our clothes and so forth. That's not how it works, is it? But I think it is. But I mean, United States is different to Europe, and it's different to Sweden because it's such a huge place. And but I mean, if we talk about Indians, can I give you a compliment?
Please.
Yes, I am teaching now here in Berlin, and I have a lot of Indian students, and they are good.
Thank you. I'm glad
They
the
are,
students are good. Yeah.
yeah, they are good, and I also have the impression that they are. I talked to a colleague about it today, that they are no nonsense. They are not so much woke. They are not so much, caught in this, actually what we are talking about, this multicultural whirlwind. They are focused on learning and they are clever. And I have a feeling that they are curious and it's quite easy to, the whole teaching process is quite easy with people from India.
Why? Because, I studied in America, I studied in England. I think a lot of Indian students go to America, to England, to Berlin, to Paris to
Yeah.
understand and absorb the best of that culture. They are not landing up there to show how Indian they are, if you know what I mean.
No. And I mean, you're practically minded, which is very good.
Yeah.
Because, the whole idea that it's like the multicultural idea of the world, it's like the world is transformed into some kind of gigantic, exterior zoo where everyone is supposed to, we are observing each other's peculiarities and we embrace it and we think it's lovely. And I think this is like it's like a big joke because that's not how people function. They want to blend in. People like to do sacrifices. If I go to a country, I've lived in Vietnam and many countries, you want to understand, and then you give up parts of your culture. And giving up parts of my Swedish identity, I'm not in pain when I do it. I will retain my Swedish identity, but it's like, the whole diversity idea, it's like, the moment we have to sacrifice even the tiniest bit of our historical identity is so painful, we might barely survive as a result of it. And this is so ridiculous. It paints a picture of human beings as so thin-skinned we can barely move. And it's like so that's
Talk to me,
that's
Göran,
like,
about the political. Now, let's talk about, as we come towards the end of our conversation, I want to
yeah.
ask you a few questions about the political implication of all that we discussed so far, right?
Right. Yes.
And let's begin again with Sweden as your home country.
Yeah.
What is today? We are today at a time when, and I began by talking about how safe Malmo used to be. Today, we
Yeah.
are all horrified to hear about gang wars in Malmo. I mean, I
Yeah.
almost cannot conceive of it, right? Today, what is the political implication of all of this in Sweden, in Germany, in France, and in other parts of Europe?
I can just give you a few. Thanks for getting back to that. I can give you a few details. I wrote a report a few years ago about the combination of ethnic background and criminality, and I came to the conclusion that generally migrants are about 2 times more prevalent among people suspected on reasonable grounds for having committed crimes. But if you talk about, the more serious the crime, the higher the overrepresentation, so to speak, among migrants. So if we talk about murders, the overrepresentation of migrants generally was about 3 or 4. And there was actually a newspaper just a few days ago, a reliable source, a newspaper presenting figures about the 18, I think it was this year, the 18 murders committed by gang-related murders in Sweden. There were 18 of them. And they wanted to know whether it was like 60 or 70% related to migrants, but they came to the conclusion that every single of these crimes had been committed by migrants, and not even one of them had been committed by, native Swedes. So based on that quite disquieting information, it is pretty obvious to say that we have a huge problem with migration. But if we go to the political implications of Sweden, I think the reaction, I need to say this, I think the reaction in Sweden has been very slow, enormously slow, and I have a friend who is a lawyer pretty high up in the administration, and he told me that I mean, things are still working, but we have a soaring number of crimes that need urgent handling. But he told me that it works, and it will keep working for another 2, 3, 4 years. But eventually the number of crimes, and unfortunately most of them related to migrant and migrant gangs, will simply be too large to be able to handle by the bureaucracies and the administration we have in terms of police force and the courts and so forth. And then he said, then the system will no longer work. And when the system no longer works, I don't know what that means, but it probably means that we can no longer take care of the criminality we have in our country. And so this is rather disquieting pieces of information that he gave me. But yeah. And politically, just to go back to this idea we talked about before about this political polarization, we have now in Sweden a political situation where the middle ground has been, to use this phrase, has been caving in over the last 10 or 20 years. So we now have a fairly big social democratic party, and we have an almost equally big Sweden Democratic Party, which is supposed to be a populist party, but it's like a social conservative right-wing party, to a great extent fueled by or targeting the rising immigration, and they want to reduce it. So we have a political situation where the middle ground, the political middle ground, has been caving in over the last 20 years. And I don't want to sound alarmistic, and I surely don't want to talk about 1933, but and then yet I did it. This is a recipe for some kind of major problems coming our way. So it's I don't want to be too pessimistic. I think there is a way out, and there has to be a way out. But I think Sweden, we have, without nobody forcing us, Swedish politicians has put Swedish society on a very dangerous place, and surely there is a way out of it. But it needs a lot of work, and it needs a great change of some very fundamental principles in our country, I think.
A little bit about the two major economies now of Europe who face some very similar problems, especially Germany. And both these two economies, Germany and France, two of the most powerful large countries of Europe, face very similar problems. And in fact, deep political problems because of this. There's, of course, other problems, inflation, all kinds of other issues. But very critically, the same sort of problems that Sweden faces also in Germany. And, today, Angela Merkel has become a figure of a lot of criticism because of this, and also in France. Talk to me a little bit about how you see the French-German situation evolve. Again, the French government in deep trouble, Germany, again, politics in deep trouble. What's going on there?
Well, I heard about a year or two ago that in relation to some waves of crime in I think it was Paris or some other city that France is on the boil. France is because of, I mean, one thing that people maybe do not talk about, and people who are in favor large-scale migration, they might say that, there's not a problem. But then sadly, we might not have a problem, or actually nothing is happening because we have self-censorship. Samuel Paty is a good case in point. He was decapitated because he wanted to teach on Muhammad, and he dared showing a picture of Muhammad, so he was decapitated. And I have some connections with some French experts on this, and also some Danish experts, and they say that many teachers throughout France are considering leaving their occupation because they feel they can no longer teach the way they want to. And some schools in France there are systematic attempts to take over these schools by Islamists, and they are pushing educational material which has very little to do with French traditions. Educational material and trying to change schools from within. And we see these trends in Sweden also. And so you could say that there's a growing self-censorship in France, and you have the same tendency in Germany also. And I'm sitting here in Berlin, and I mean it's dangerous, because when you talk like this, people might think you're just a right-wing thug, and you have no mercy for anybody who is not like European or native Sweden and so forth. That's not the case. There are a lot of people who are working hard and doing a great job. But if you have a look in Berlin and you just observe the people around you, you can see that many people are not Germans here. I mean, they came to Germany and they are doing a great job, but you sense that I am worried, because I feel that if you talk about some kind of unifying idea, some kind of commonality, and then you hear people talking 10 different languages around you, and then you think, so where is the unifying idea here? Where is the unifying idea in the bus, on the train, on the square, when you sense that there are like 5 or 6 or 7 cultures going on at the same time in Berlin or in Paris? I think I think this is, I mean, these are interesting times, but I think I think the situation is worse than many people seem to realize. And just to get back to my home country, Sweden, we have in Sweden, and I have friends who have insight in these issues. We have in Sweden infiltration in a lot of bureaucracies, meaning that people from other cultures are getting jobs in bureaucracy, such as our migration authorities. And once they are inside these organizations, they can start infiltrating them. And their guiding principle is not the Swedish state. Their guiding principle might be something else, like a clan or a family or other financial interests outside of Sweden. And the reason why these people have acquired these jobs has been because of multiculturalism to a great extent. We need diversity because diversity is enriching. Diversity is good for us. Multiculturalism is good for us. And but then we end up in a situation where people are, like I've said many times here, I believe, where people are pulling in different directions. We are not walking in the same direction, like the old social democratic prime minister said. We are not pulling all of us in the same direction. People are pulling in all kinds of different directions. And as far as I can see it, this cannot go on. This will eventually lead to some kind of breakup of the society we have. So I am, and I guess you understand that I'm not wholeheartedly advocating multiculturalism or diversity. I think it's essentially a misconceived idea, because every society, societies were founded, nations were founded by one idea, and so they have been working, like France and Germany and so forth. They were founded by one idea, People went to a particular place, and then they started, and they created a language, they created an idea, they created history, culture, identity, and so forth. And now suddenly, Brussels and all these forces are, tearing apart everything that seemed to be working pretty well, and they are mixing people, and then they say, "Look at it, it's going to be wonderful." I don't think so.
I want to ask you a
Yeah.
question about this. While all of this is genuinely happening, I gave you the example of Indians in America or Indians in the UK and so on and so forth. Um, there is also a great need for skilled labor to move. Many countries, including in Europe, need skilled labor. And on one hand, they are starved of skilled labor. On
Mm.
another hand, all the problems that we've just discussed exist. How do you think these two things will be balanced? Because there is a need for skilled labor to appear and arrive and start working in many societies. For instance, when Brexit happened, British agriculture went through a deep crisis because a lot of the Polish and Romanian and many other workers just disappeared. So,
Mhm.
how do you think this balancing act will happen between the need, for instance, say, or to get trained IT professionals from India, which might be needed in countries like Germany and others for technology, and this crisis of multiculturalism as you're depicting? Where is the balance? How does one balance this?
Well, I'm not sure, to be provocative here. I'm not sure I'm in favor of a balance at all. I remember when, 2015, and when politicians on the left, they said we have so many great doctors, medical doctors coming from Syria, and they were so happy. And then I thought, well, maybe these doctors are needed in Syria. Maybe they are needed more in Syria than in Sweden, but there was no discussion whatsoever about it. The only thing people talked about was that these people are so educated and they are wonderful and we need them. And I just don't understand this kind of rhetoric. To me, it sounds extremely egotistic and arrogant that these people come from war-torn regions and countries. You can also talk about IT specialists from India, which is a much more well-functioning society. You could ask yourself, why on earth are these people supposed to come to Sweden? They were educated in India, and then people with Sweden are supposed to steal them. Educated people. Okay, so they will no longer be in India. They will no longer give back somehow the education they were given in terms of a good day's work until they are retired. So that is my comment, and I'm surprised that so few people seem to hook up to this kind of train of thought. That I mean, United States have been accused by in Europe for giving, once you have a PhD, then the big universities in the United States, they give these young people a very tempting offer, and then they fly over to Los Angeles or to San Francisco or to New York, all places, and they have a lovely career. So United States, they allow Europe to give them a basic education, then they just pick them. And I would claim that Sweden has been doing the same thing with people from Syria. They're educated in Syria, and then we take them. I think they should go back, and I think they should also think about their home country. And we should also realize that what we are doing is we are taking the most educated people, maybe from India, from Syria, from these places. Maybe they should go back. Maybe that's where they are needed much more than they are needed in Denmark or Sweden, honestly.
I have one last question for you, Professor Adamson, which is that where do you see the political turmoil of all of this finally headed towards in 5 years, 10 years? We just spoke about governments being dysfunctional in Germany and France. Where is all of this headed?
Oh my God! I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that. I'm quite good at painting gloomy pictures, but if you want an answer, you should ask a politician, and they might lie anyway. But at least they will say something. I can't see in the crystal ball into the future. I have a friend in Sweden, and he probably will listen to this, and he told me that we are approaching 20 years of darkness, and I would very much like to disagree with him. I think there is hope, but I think Sweden is eventually waking up to the fact that the situation we're faced with now cannot quite go on. We have been, I mean, importing is maybe a ruthless word, but we have been taking on hundreds of thousands of migrants per year. And that's like the equivalent of a minor city in my country. And it is impossible to give these people any kind of decent existence because Sweden is far too small. I think, to see it optimistically, I think if I should try to come up with a conclusion, because I think you like that and the viewers might like that. I would like to say to the European Union, okay, let's go ahead. Let's move forward. But Sweden should not take on one single migrant more than its proportion to the European Union. Not one. And I also think that, this has also been discussed in Sweden quite thoroughly and more recently, that if people do not behave, if people don't have a citizenship, they should be sent home to their country of origin. They can't just stay in Sweden and commit crimes. We have been far too lenient in this respect. So things has to be tightened quite substantially. And this also means a kind of a shift in the general perception in my country. And let me finish by one additional wish. And this is about the universities in Sweden, because the universities in Sweden have been under the influence of a very, very powerful left-wing agenda for like 20, 30 years. And this has to come to an end. And I am not saying, like some of my maybe colleagues and people who are more to the right, they would say that we should replace a left-wing agenda with a right-wing agenda at the university. This is not the way to go. My conclusion, my recipe is to replace an ideological agenda, be it on the left or on the right, with an agenda of meritocracy and an agenda of openness, an agenda of open debate, where any statement should be met with curiosity to open up for a vibrant discussion in academia, because at present this discussion is waning and perhaps even in places non-existent. So the situation in at the university and in higher education is extremely important if you want to analyze if you want to have a diagnosis of what's going on in a society. So that's something I really would like to foster, a complete refurbishment of the university in my country.
We'll have to leave it at that. Professor Göran Adamson joining me from Berlin, talking about multiculturalism and Europe in his own home country of Sweden, and of course in other parts of Europe, especially France and Germany. Thanks very much for your time, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
And of course, for all these enlightening conversations from around the world, you only have to click the bell icon on the YouTube channel of Global Order. We will be bringing you conversations like this from around the world on topics that matter to each one of us. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Thanks for your time.